It may be allied to a far-right party, but the Austrian government says it is considering banning a far-right movement. The reason? An alleged connection with the Christchurch attacker in New Zealand. Vienna says it won't tolerate any kind of extremism. But is anyone convinced? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. The Austrian government says it won't tolerate what it considers extremist ideology, and it's now considering disbanding the far-right Identitarian movement and investigating whether that group is a terrorist organization. That decision was made after it was confirmed the movement's leader, Martin Sellner, received nearly $1,700 from the man accused of carrying out the Christchurch mosque attacks in New Zealand. But he's denied any ties to white supremacist Brenton Tarrant. Austria is the only country in Western Europe with a far-right presence in government. The leader of the right-wing Freedom Party has distanced himself from the Identitarians. And the country's Chancellor Sebastian Kurz says radical ideologies are not welcome in Austria.
Our position on this is very clear. No kind of extremism whatsoever, whether it's radical Islamists or right-wing extremist fanatics, has any place in our country and our society.
Now, the Identitarian movement, Austria, is part of a larger far-right Identitarian movement which began in the early 2000s. Identitarianism originally started in France and spread to Western Europe, North America, and New Zealand. It aims to fight what it calls massive immigration and the Islamization of Europe. Identitarians often attack multiculturalism and use Islamophobic rhetoric. They say they fear a systematic so-called great replacement of Europe's white Christian population by non-Europeans. Identitarians are considered by some to be the new media-friendly face of far-right nationalism and focus on recruiting young people. Well, let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. Joining us from Vienna is Michael Bonvalot, a journalist, author, and expert on the far right in Austria. In Berlin, we have Emily Gorsensky, researcher and advisory board member to the Prosecution Project, a research lab studying political violence. She is the creator of First Vigil, a database tracking far-right criminality since 2016. And joining us from Washington, D.C., Cynthia Miller-Idris, professor of sociology at the American University and author of The Extreme Gone Mainstream, Commercialization and the Far-Right Youth Culture in Germany. Welcome to the program. So, Michael Bonvalot, how prevalent is this Identitarian movement in Austria, and how connected is it to the current Austrian government? I mean, they are distancing themselves from this group, but how connected are they really?
You know, right now there is this process of distancing, especially from the far-right Freedom Party, which is in government. But in fact, there are a lot of very close and proven ties between the FPO, which is in government, and the Identitarian movement, this fascist group. So what we could say is that the group Identitarian movement in itself is pretty weak. That's maybe some 100 activists. But what is important on them is especially their links to government parties.
Emily Gorsensky, what is it about this movement that appeals particularly to younger people in Europe, and how does it brand itself in a way that's different from some of the traditional far-right groups that we've heard about in the past?
Well, I think that one of the things that we see with this group is that they're very keen on their perception and their optics, as they like to put it. And we see a lot of young men in particular who join this movement as part of something bigger to be a part of. And they see themselves as being slighted on many angles. They're young, they're white, they're male. And they sort of see this identity politics playing out in media, in pop culture, and the Identitarian movement is, in a way, its own form of identity politics, targeting young men in particular.
Cynthia, how does this? What similarities do you draw between these groups in Europe and what you've seen and studied in the United States?
Well, these are all part of the same phenomenon of mainstreaming of extremist aesthetics, and some of the ideas even, I think, as Emily was just saying, what you're seeing is that there's a softer kind of language, a more coded kind of language. So we're not going to talk about race. We'll talk about European heritage. We're not going to talk about white separatism, but we'll use the language of remigration or remigration, depending on how that's framed. And so there's a way of coding and softening, and it makes it seem less exclusionary, although it's not.
And we heard some of that rhetoric, didn't we, in the Charlottesville rallies that took place, of course, back in 2017, and we heard the chants from them saying Jews will not replace us. Just explain what that means and how that's part of this, what they call the Great Replacement.
Yeah, the theory of the Great Replacement, which comes from a French far-right scholar, is about demographic change. It's about this idea that, they also use the language of white genocide, the language that that white populations are shrinking ethnically due to demographic change, and that through birth rate replacement, there will be a shrinking and ever shrinking population of whites, and framing that as a threat. And I'll say that I think one of the challenges that governments and communities across the world have to face right now is understanding that even if that's true, we have to find ways to frame demographic change in other ways and offer an alternative to young people to not see demographic change as a threat, but instead to see it as an asset.
Emily Gosensky, you mentioned earlier that this movement seems to largely appeal to kind of disaffected white men who want to be, part of something greater than themselves. But it also appeals to a lot of women as well, doesn't it? It cuts across a lot of demographics.
Yeah, that's true. There are a lot of women in the movement. There's sort of a subset of the movement called the Traditionalist Movement, and that appeals to this notion of heritage, whether it's American heritage or European heritage, which is centered around the nuclear family and the woman's role in the household versus the man's role in the household. And so there are a lot of men in the movement, but there is a strong subset of the movement that is appealing to this sort of traditional notion of femininity, this traditional notion of gender roles. And so what we saw in Charlottesville in particular was amidst this you will not replace us mentality, there was also quite a bit of antagonism towards people who were queer or gay or transgender. There was a lot of antagonism towards this notion of the erosion of these traditional, what they perceive as traditional values in our society. And so this movement sort of likes to define those roles and have certain, I'd say, duties for different people in the movement. The women are supposed to go out and they're supposed to serve the men who are out there on the street. And in Charlottesville, we saw that women were required to carry the torches on August 11th during the torch rally, and they were forbidden from attending the rally at the park the next day.
Michael Bonvalot, Martin Sellner, who's the leader in Austria of this IBO party that took money from the alleged shooter in New Zealand, he's saying that they have no connection to this man or what he did, and that they are a peaceful, albeit anti-immigration group that has nothing to do with violence. Does that fit in at all with what you've seen there?
Basically, it's clear it's a neo-fascist group. So if we talk about their stand on violence or non-violence, that's mainly a tactical stand that they have. And like in public, they try not to look very violent. But what is clear is it was mentioned before, this ideology of a so-called great replacement, which they say might occur. But they also say that they are the so-called last generation to prevent that. So if you are, or if you see yourself as a last generation to prevent something, of course, everything is allowed to do that. And they share also some common ideology, like they share this ideology of supremacy, they share this ideology of as was mentioned before, the question of women's rights, of LGBT rights, and so on. So there is some common ground. So I would say that if the Identitarian movement now tries to distance itself from attacks like Christchurch, that's a tactical distance and they have tactical differences. But the ideology, there are very many similarities.
And Michael Bonvalot, how much has mainstream politics in Europe played a part in fueling these movements? Because in the past, they were often dismissed as kind of fringe groups with very small numbers and not really a threat. But we're seeing a lot of this narrative now being taken up by some mainstream parties, fear of immigration and so on. That's not I mean, that's something that's happened quite a lot in the last few years. How do we explain that?
Well, it seems that there are some far-right parties which take the topic of migration for their political agenda. They are also in government in some countries, like in Austria, in Hungary, in Poland. But what we shouldn't forget, while we are sitting here, people are dying in the Mediterranean Sea. And it's the politics of the European Union who is responsible for this mass killing. And if all the major parties, if the European Union, if the far right, all of them tell you that migration might be a problem and that you have to set up the borders and the fences and have to accept that people are dying in the sea, then it's clear that those who are the most radical in that position will also gain some ground.
Emily Gorsensky, is there do you see a common thread here in a lot of these movements, in some of the rhetoric that we've heard from mainstream politicians like Viktor Orban, for example, Hungary's prime minister? He built a fence against the migrants in 2015 and began calling himself a defender of Christian Europe. There was this, frenzied opposition to Muslim immigration, real or imaginary, and this has been something that's united a lot of these populist right parties in Germany and Poland, Sweden, and Italy, throughout Europe.
Yeah, I think that the rhetoric here is extremely similar. And what's concerning is if you look at the rhetoric and if you look at the tone and the language being used in some of these manifestos, speeches, and even political campaigns, there's not much difference. And if you were to, without knowing which words came from which speech, it would be very difficult to determine whether it was a politician's speech or a manifesto from a terrorist. There's an incident that comes to mind where Sellner was due to speak last March in the UK, and he was detained by British border authorities, and Tommy Robinson gave his speech instead. And if you read the text of that speech, it is almost identical in the words, the phrasing, and the tone to both the Christchurch shooters manifesto, to a manifesto written by a terror group in the United States that was prevented from bombing a Muslim community in Kansas, and the language that we see coming out of political leaders in Hungary, Poland, and even the United States.
Cynthia, when we talk about trying to combat the rise of these groups, I mean, in Austria, the government's talking about banning them altogether. But is that really the solution, especially when it brings up issues of free speech and so on? I mean, have we got this backwards? Does there need to be a greater effort to promote understanding in all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think that what we know from banning. I mean, Germany has the best is the best example of banning policies, and I completely empathize and understand with why the bans have been put in place on various symbols. But you'll have schools that ban the number 88 because it stands for the 8th letter of the alphabet, for HH for Heil Hitler, and they don't want kids to display it. And kids start wearing T-shirts that say 87 plus 1 or 100 minus 12. I mean, the banning creates its own kind of coding that then gets around the bans. And I think we're going to see that with the Facebook banning right now, is that they're not going to be able to ban and monitor coded content. So I think, I'm not saying that we shouldn't ban or we shouldn't be monitoring and surveilling and relying on intelligence, but that there's no world in which that's enough. And I think that what we have to be looking for are much deeper preventative solutions that acknowledge what both Emily and Michael were just saying, which is that this is not just a problem of the fringe, that it's not just a problem that the extreme has gone more mainstream, but it's a problem that the mainstream has moved toward the extreme. And so we have to address that within the mainstream by reasserting what it means to live in an inclusive democracy and helping all young people, but also across the lifespan, understand how we are going to live together in a time of significantly changed diversity.
Emily Gorsensky, when you look at what happened with the alleged shooter in New Zealand, this was a young man who claimed to have developed his own violent beliefs all by himself. He went on the internet, he traveled through Europe, he bought the weapons himself, he honed his skills in a suburban shooting range. No one there suspected that he was preparing a massacre. So I guess my question is, how do you stop? I mean, he wasn't on anyone's radar. So how are you going to stop something like this happening again?
Well, I think that we have to look at the modes of how these people are radicalized. We know where these communities are. We know the groups that they're chatting in. We know the types of behaviors that they're embracing. And it is difficult to identify that shooter before, because you don't know who it's going to be. And that's sort of the whole point. That's this idea of leaderless resistance or stochastic terrorism that has been promoted by the far-right groups since the late 1970s. The idea here is that rather than having a commander or a cell or any sort of directed attack, that the rhetoric is clear in what is necessary in their eyes, for what types of violence, what types of public activism needs to be done to spread their message. And so there doesn't need to be a group. Sellner didn't, I have no reason to believe that he told Tarrant to go and shoot up a mosque. But the rhetoric is clear, and if you, again, read the words that they're saying, they're elevating that temperature of violence. They're trying to form oppositional groups. They're looking at Muslims as an oppositional group. They're looking at Antifa as an oppositional group. And it becomes clear to these people, when you immerse yourself in that culture, some percentage of them are going to decide to act out violently. And so in order to identify and stop those threats, we have to figure out a way to lower that temperature.
Michael Bonvalot, how much of a role has social media played in fueling all of this? I mean, we had this announcement from Facebook that they were going to shut down all of these white nationalist groups, and that's obviously something to be commended. But the internet is such a vast platform. There's nothing to stop these groups from just going somewhere else to have all of their discussions and so on. So I mean, it's an endless battle, isn't it?
Well, of course it plays some role. Like the group Identitarian Movement, they might have like 200 activists in Austria, but they went very strong because they understood how social media works, and of course others helped them, like the current Austrian Vice Chancellor Heinz-Christian Strache from the Freedom Party. He shared contributions by the Identitarian movement on Facebook, helping to make them strong. But on the other hand, this is not a social media phenomenon alone. Like the German Nazis and Austrian Nazis in the 1930s, they had no Facebook and no Twitter, and still they were able to rise. So same with what was mentioned before, this question of the lone wolves of right-wing terrorism. There is some social base for them. There is some base in society for them, and that what gives them the possibility to gain successes and to get stronger.
Cynthia, when you look at the rise of these white extremist groups in the US, it's not something that just popped up in the last couple of years. It's clearly something, when you look at the numbers, it's clearly something that's been on the rise for quite some time. Yet we're only hearing about now in the last couple of years. Why is that? I mean, is there a sense that the government just kind of took its eye off the ball in this?
Well, I think that we know that these groups have been around, obviously, for some time. There were traditional groups, the KKK, the Aryan Brotherhood in prisons. We had the Patriot militias that started after the Vietnam War. But those were always regarded as fringe. They had an aesthetic kind of appearance that made them come across as quite fringe and very clearly not part of the mainstream. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is that these groups have both expanded their base and they also have cleaned up their aesthetic in a way that makes it difficult for people to recognize them and recognize their ideas for as violent and as extremist as they are. And I think this gets back to that question of whether ideas can be violent. And I think we're seeing that even groups that espouse nonviolence, are expressing violent ideas that, if followed through to their logical conclusion, have to result in violence. And so that's, I think, where we're seeing a broadening of the base and more visibility, and of course an amplification over social media and the more violent acts that have occurred over the past few years. So there's a whole range of things happening, but it has moved out of fringe groups into more mainstream, broader base. Unquestionably, there's no doubt about that.
Emily Gorsenski, how incumbent is it upon the authorities to do more to promote awareness of these groups? I'm not just talking about from the security point of view. I'm talking about getting the wider public at large to be more aware of this.
Well, I think that it's the place to start with that is with education and with improving access and knowledge to people of different cultures, people of different backgrounds. We see that helps when young people grow up in environments where they have greater access to a variety of cultural experiences. And so I think that that's super important to start with that. There is certainly some degree to which law enforcement needs to or could play a role, and they have largely been neglectful of white nationalist groups and white supremacist violence, particularly in the US and Western Europe over time. But I think that part of what we need to do is to look at this idea of regulation versus sort of leading people to come to these values on their own. And if we keep building a society where our schools are segregated, where there's class divisions in terms of who has access to what types of experience and education, that's really going to continue to breed this sort of hate-based movements. We don't see that the people who are populating these groups and these activist circles, they're not what most people think. They're not lower class generally. They're middle class, they're white, and they have access to good education. What they don't have access to is a wide range of cultural experiences. And that is sort of leading to this shock that they have now that they're starting to see things like immigration into Europe or into the Americas.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much to all three of you, Michael Bonvalot, Emily Gorsenski, Cynthia Miller-Idris. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can see the program again anytime. Just go to our website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, there's our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.